Rich is just going to have a talk about I guess a strategy that he talks about a lot, which is around this risk and reward. So actually evaluating risk and reward in terms of your nitrogen strategy. So over to you, Rich. Thank you.
Thanks, Marguerite. So this is not sort of a one-way transfer part of the presentation. This is very much exploring whether you think a concept like this is a good idea. It comes from a project we've been involved in with Sadi in South Australia, Peter Heyman, who put together what we call a rapid decision analysis. And this is nothing complicated. This is just basic stuff. It's just putting together a spreadsheet that captures our mental processes, our assumptions. But the key with what you're seeing here is on that horizontal line at the bottom, because what we find is people think of the future as a point rather than the future is a distribution of possibilities. And so we think of putting on nitrogen in October, maybe November, when we may or may not get rain. We judge the future as a single event rather than thinking, well, it could be anything from very dry through to very wet if you have a cutoff low. And so all we've done here is try to take a very simple matrix in a spreadsheet that says, all right, let's say, what is our pasture growth rate from a very dry year? So let's assume the next 6 weeks are very dry through to very wet. What growth rate would we get? All right, if we put on 40 kilos of nitrogen, what additional growth rate would we get as a result of that nitrogen across a spectrum of a very dry next 6 weeks through to a very wet 6 weeks? And then on the right, you've got the risk versus reward, which you can then graph from that, where you've said, okay, what's it cost me to put out that nitrogen? What are the extra forage I got? And if I didn't get that forage, what would I have to spend to make up the difference of that forage? And so you end up with a horizontal axis that says, what's it going to cost me? And so the base case of we're just going to do nothing is across the horizontal there. And then the angled line says, what would be the risk versus reward? What would be the income versus loss of putting on that nitrogen for that October, November dry period? Well, if you got it right and it was a wet year, you would get a great outcome. But it doesn't keep going because excess wet starts leveling off. So if you have a cutoff low and you get completely saturated, well, it's not going to keep going. So the top does level off. And then you come down to the bottom left where you say, well, if we got it wrong and it turned out to be excessively dry, what would happen? But then we started thinking, well, nitrogen does carry over. Some of Dave's stuff says that nitrogen applied in the annual rye actually benefits the Kikuyu. And so you have another graph that comes in that says, let's make an assumption about the nitrogen that carries over from that graph on the right to the graph on the left. And we get a very different scenario emerging. So on the right, it says, well, you know, the risk versus reward is about cuts off somewhere in the middle there, where half the time we could get a good outcome. The other half the time we're going to make a loss. It's not going to be worth putting that nitrogen out. If we make some assumption that some of that nitrogen we put out, if it turns out to be very dry, some of that nitrogen will still carry on and benefit us later when the rain does come. And so it's not all lost. You get a very different scenario emerging where it actually says there's no downside to putting on the nitrogen. So in my mind, if you look at where that crossover exists, it's only in an extremely dry outcome of all the 6 possibilities, or of all the 10 possibilities we had across the bottom of the screen here. It's only the driest 2 of those scenarios where we didn't actually get some reward for putting out the nitrogen, where we were slightly ahead. So that's probably all I wanted to present, was just the is this useful way of thinking? And all it is changing your thinking from thinking about the future as a single point to thinking about the future as a distribution of possibilities. And if we apply that to nitrogen fertilizer as a late spring nitrogen decision, I would say the left-hand graph tells us we should just do it, because the reward is so much greater than the risk in most scenarios that you can imagine. That's all, Marguerite. I just wanted to put it out there that there's a very simple way of doing a risk for reward about putting on nitrogen at times of the year, And a very simple change in assumption between no carryover and then Dave's work, which said there was a carryover benefit, changed the whole scenario completely. I don't know, does that help?
Let's ask all of those on board with this today. So definitely something we struggle with is the will I, won't I, you know, what's the risk, what's the reward is a really good way of putting it, Rich. So open up to all those who are on board today. Do we have any questions for Rich over, especially what he's just presented there as a sort of, I guess it's almost like a thought process of, you know, how do we actually decide whether we go with it or not? Do we apply, don't we, and at what sort of rate? So over to you. Is there anyone who, if we just have you stop sharing your screen, Rich, and we'll get Dave's on, and we'll just open up the chat to anyone that might have a question at this point in time.
So I guess the point is that spreadsheet exercise, sitting with Peter Heyman, it took me 10 minutes to just plug in some assumption values of what the growth rate I'll get in those 4, 5, 6 scenarios, wet through to dry. What additional growth rate could I get out of 40 kilos of N, and what the price of buying alternatives would be. That's it. And all you've done is spread the future rather than have one point in the future.
Just one question, Richard.
Yeah.
Are there a couple of other things we can do to reduce the losses of nitrogen, say things like getting better distribution of manure by harrowing, or yeah, those sort of things?
Yeah, certainly. There's quite a few things. You know, tailoring the rate to the conditions makes a big difference. The timing of nitrogen, so putting on nitrogen, say 2 weeks after grazing, and then having a big rainfall event is far more risky than putting on nitrogen at grazing when the plant is taking it up at a far more rapid rate. So, you know, you think of it putting on straight after grazing, and then you've got this very high rate of uptake of nitrogen in the first 7 days post grazing. Whereas if you put it on 2 weeks after grazing, the uptake is a lot slower. And so the risk is you don't take it all out of the soil and it's there exposed for a longer time. I would also look at, you know, don't think of the farm as a single outcome. Look at the farm and say, well, if it's going to rain in the next couple of weeks or we have a cutoff low, there's some soils that will drain very quickly, other soils won't. And so you can actually back certain soil types for certain conditions. You know, like if it's going into a dry period and you've got a crasnozium soil on a hill, well, you wouldn't put nitrogen on that crasnozium because, well, it's probably dry down the bottom of the profile already. Whereas if you had a lower lying soil where the roots are still in some moisture, well, the response is going to be better to back the lower lying area than the steeper slope.
Yeah, we've certainly noticed big differences in pasture growth with pre-fertilizing paddocks up to say 2-3 days prior to grazing, and then sort of 3 days after, and sort of doing that once a week. We've noticed a big difference in pasture growth and utilisation.
Yeah, and I think that's just sensible. You know, there's a risk of ammonia loss, for example, with urea. If you're concerned about that, then putting it on, say, 48 hours before grazing is not a bad idea.
There's a couple of opinions out there on urea versus sulfate of ammonia, and I'm not quite sure of the reasons why to go for SOA over urea. Is it something to do with utilisation of the plant and with the ammonia type? Or?
Look, the type of ammonia that's released out of sulfate of ammonia versus urea is exactly the same. So no difference. At the end, you're paying 20% more for sulfate of ammonia for the nitrogen in there as opposed to urea. So the urea is much cheaper. If there is a volatilization loss, urea will lose more than ammonium sulfate. But you've got to think, you know, if you go with all the strategies about reducing ammonia loss, you can get that loss down below 10%, but the price difference is still 20%. So actually, you're still ahead using urea, even if you lost 10% to ammonia. The only case you can think of is if the pasture is actually short of sulfur, and you do need, so say you've just been using DAP and urea through the year and there's no sulfur going in, there may be a case where you bring in ammonium sulfate to give that readily available source of sulfur into the system. You would probably look at doing that prior to the winter because your sulfur is really needed through the spring period and you want it in the soil and reactive before you hit the spring period. But I'd only do it once to get the sulfur in. If if you've only been using DAP with no sulfur input, then you'd consider one application of ammonium sulfate sometime in the autumn period, maybe winter period, so that it's in the soil by the spring. I don't know, that's my thinking on it.
Thanks, Rich. And I guess thanks, James. And that question brings us nicely into the question around product or source. So Dave's going to give us some insights into enhanced efficiency fertilizers. Not all EEFs are the same or have the same attributes, and they deliver different things. So Dave's going to give us an outline on what the differences are and actually talk about when use may actually be justified or the additional cost. So over to you, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Margaret. So this follows in quite nicely from, well, the discussion we just had, but also from Rich's risk reward with the carryover. So one thing that we know does influence carryover or can enhance carryover, particularly, is some of these enhanced efficiency fertilizer products. So it'll even move that scenario even more in that case. So enhanced efficiency fertilizers, also known as next generation fertilizers, whatever you want to call them, there are more and more coming onto the market. There's a whole bunch of different types out there. I suppose we'll just be covering some of the major ones. They're basically breaking down into three major categories. There's the volatilization inhibiting urease. They target a specific enzyme through that volatilization process. So they're only really important, first of all, on urea or ammonia sources, or also particularly if you think that that's a major loss pathway. And that's the most important part is, is that a major loss pathway that you think you need to target? If you're in an irrigated system where you can put water on straight away, or basically you run the low risk of volatilization losses anyway, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later, then there's no real benefit to applying that particular type of inhibitor. The second type of inhibitor, so that's basically what are known as volatilization inhibitors. The most common commercial one on the market is green urea. And that basically stops this ammonia pathway, basically from urea being the main source, but also from other ammonium fertilizers. There is work where they can spray it onto urine or whatnot as well, but that's not considered a major economic loss pathway in Australia. So the next type of inhibitors are what are known as nitrification inhibitors. These basically stop the nitrification process, which is the conversion of ammonium into nitrate. So they stop this process here, and that sort of reduces the instance of nitrate build up in your profile. When you have a lot of water combined with high nitrate, you can get a lot of leaching, so you can lose your nitrogen through subsurface water leaching, or through gaseous nitrous oxides or N2, so gaseous emissions through this nitrification denitrification pathway. So that particular type of inhibitor, the nitrification inhibitor, the most common one on the market at the moment are the NTEC, that's an Intertech Privet product, and DCD. So NTEC is actually a coating you can get on the urea itself. So it's basically the same as normal urea, just with the coating and, of course, with the price premium. DCD, there's a lot of work being done on DCD in New Zealand, particularly around urine patches and whatnot, to try and reduce gaseous losses, particularly of these nitrogen N2O nitrous oxide gaseous losses using that product. The third type of inhibitor or enhanced efficiency fertilizer are these basically ones that provide a physical coating. So there's a whole suite of these ones that basically all it does is it physically stops or slows down the release either of urea into ammonium, so in this pathway here, or basically just stops the access of water into that product. So they can be either a polymer. You can get like black ureas. There's coated with like a charcoal. sulfur-coated ureas. There's a whole range of different coatings that you can look at, and there's a lot of them on the market. Once again, they come at quite a premium, but they basically work the same way as the nitrification inhibitors by basically trying to reduce that release of nitrogen, so you don't end up with a big pool of nitrate. Nitrate's what the bugs love. It's easily leached. It's what you don't want a huge amount of in your soil. You want to try and retain that in the ammonium form to try and allow the plants to access that as a slow release, not as a big sugar hit. So they're the basically major types. They're the sort of targets the different processes that you need to target. I suppose as a simple rule of thumb, one take-home message, the two most common ones are the urease inhibitors, the green urea, and the nitrification inhibitors, the NTEC products. They act on two very different processes in the soil. So if there's ways you can get your urea into the soil so you're not worried about fertilization, then you don't even need to think about green urea. A lot of our research has been done on that NTEC product, the nitrification inhibitor, and I'll show you some of that shortly. By basically reducing the amount of nitrate that accumulates in the soil, we can also increase this interaction here with soil organic matter. And once again, that feeds into my previous talk around basically that carryover. So we can actually increase the carryover using this product. So a bit of a summary, I suppose, on some of the research that's done on urease inhibitors before we move on. So this is, as I said, this is the green urea product. Under certain conditions, and a lot of this work's been done by one of Richard's colleagues down at the University of Melbourne, Helen Suter. They can be substantial. You can get substantial economic losses of nitrogen fertilizer through volatilization. And you can see on this graph up in the top left-hand corner here, we're looking at quite high rates. We're looking at up to 5 kilograms of nitrogen being lost per day via volatilization. And obviously, as soon as you get any sort of rainfall or moisture that moves from the soil, that drops off very rapidly. But you can lose a fair chunk of your nitrogen in that process. So, what are the nitrogen conditions that to lead to that? And that's the most important thing you need to understand to say whether it's going to be valid for you to use this product or not. The urease inhibitor does work when we have these sort of high loss conditions. We can reduce nitrogen losses from up to 30% of our urea to down to 9%. But these are under worst case scenario conditions. So most of the time, and this is what we found at our casino trial, we use these products. We use these products in nitrogen hungry systems, so we expect to see a response. But we're using these products by best management practice of applying it before grazing, making sure the urea is down within the canopy. Volatilization losses are driven by three things: high temperatures, high heat, and high wind speed. And basically, the wind speed at your soil surface, particularly in a big thick mat sort of thatched canopy, particularly in Kikuyu, less so in ryegrass, but still so in ryegrass. The wind speed at ground zero is almost zero. So if you can get it down in the canopy, interaction with the soil, and spreading it before grazing is a nice effective way of doing that, then there's very low likelihood that you get any losses or very low losses of volatilization. And so this is what this bar graph down the bottom here showed. We have a series of treatments here. So low fertilizer rate with urea, high fertilizer rate with urea, and then we use the green urea product. And there was no benefit of using the green urea product, this last column here, and this column here over conventional urea under these conditions. So unless you get those really extreme conditions where it's blowing a gale, really hot, it's probably not worth putting on urease inhibitors. Having said that, those conditions do occur sometimes, particularly in this northern part of the world. A rain front is often followed by those exact sort of conditions. So if you do want to get the fertilizer on and you think there might be a risk of that, you got either got low canopy or you got no means of getting the urea into the canopy, and you're expecting those sort of hot and windy conditions, plus there's moisture in the soil and you need to get the nitrogen on, then there may be some justification for it, but it really comes to that cost benefit analysis, and this is a product that costs sort of 20% premium. So the next product is this nitrification inhibitor. So this is the DNPP product, also known as NTEC. This is one we've done quite a lot of work on now and shown some encouraging results. So remember, this is the one that slows down the conversion of ammonium into nitrate. So we want to try and keep it in the ammonium form. Ammonium's got a little plus on the chemical, on the molecule. Your soil organic matter and your clays mainly have a minus, so it's got this natural affiliation with the soil, whereas a nitrate molecule's also got a minus on it, so it basically repels it. So if we can keep it in the ammonium form, we're much more likely to retain it in our soils in time for the plants to take it up. So a lot of studies have been done on this because of this very complex interaction with our organic matter. And now remember that back to my pie graph earlier, where we basically got 30% of our nitrogen being taken up by the organic matter. So it's just gone straight into the organic matter. And so because of that, it's very hard to see an impact after single applications. And a lot of trials that have done this have not shown a lot of yield responses because they've only looked at very short applications. And that's because most of the plant growth we're seeing is either this carryover effect from previous fertilizations or the response of mineralization. And there's actually, what we're doing most of the time is feeding the bugs and not actually feeding the plants. But we ran these trials over 3 years. And when you start to look at the data over 3 years, then actually you start to see a bit of a difference because you start to accumulate that soil organic matter nitrogen and have better carryover. And so we can see this effect over on the left-hand side. Here we have in the shaded blue, that's our NTEC product, our nitrification inhibitor. And you can see that at an optimal rate, it does actually make a difference to growth, to pasture growth. And the reason, why we see this optimal is that, if you just put too much on, then nitrogen doesn't become the most limiting factor. It's water or it's sulfur or it's, grazing interval or something else. We don't see that effect quite so clearly in the Kikuyu. We still see a bit of a benefit, but it was most evident in the Ryegrass. And so that was sort of, if we look at this on a per cut basis, you want to be aiming at a slightly reduced rate than what you put on a conventional urea. That basically saves the nitrogen. So, that additional nitrogen that you're saving was what was conventionally lost. And once again, thinking back to my little pie graph, that yellow slot we saw of the losses was about 5 kilos. So what this is basically doing is essentially moving that yellow slot of 5 kilos from being lost to the atmosphere, actually into the soil and retaining it in the soil. And over time, we build up our more soil nitrogen and we get a better response. And if we look at that over a whole year, we actually see over on this right-hand graph now that our losses, which are the red ones, we can basically halve our losses while getting similar pasture yields. And keep in mind that we're putting on the fertilizer at half the rate here. So yeah, we have a little bit of a reduced yield, but we did an extreme reduction. Our recommendation is basically put it on at cost equivalence. So you're looking at a 20% reduction in rate, and we should be able to see a massive reduction in losses. So we basically, at half the rate, we increased yields compared to the same amount of urea, so at half the urea rate, which is not actually shown here. But we actually reduced our losses quite substantially. We reduced our losses here from basically 121 kilograms of nitrogen to 45 kilograms of nitrogen. So we basically, all that additional nitrogen that was previously lost has now gone into soil organic matter and is available for plants later on. And so why does that happen and when does that happen? Well, as I mentioned, we see those losses every single event we apply. So even under normal conditions, we still always have a small amount of nitrogen that's lost. You know, it's a very leaky element, but we get most of our losses during these East Coast lows, which we've talked about in previous webinars. And actually what we can see is if we look at our daily N losses, and this is the gaseous losses through that denitrification process, we're going up to 6 kilograms of nitrogen loss per day during one of these events through the urea, but actually our DNPP product, our NTEC inhibitor, actually reduces those losses quite substantially as well. So there's this dual impact of reducing the small losses every single application and reducing the big losses if we're, you know, happen to hit an East Coast low. And here we actually saw, not only did we see that reduction in losses, but we actually saw a pretty substantial increase in immobilization. So immobilization is when the nitrogen gets sucked back into the organic matter pool. It's taken up by the bugs, and it's essential for that carryover of nitrogen later on. So how does this all work on economics? And so one of the key points of this stuff is, well, it does cost more money. All these products cost more money. So it all basically comes down to return on investment, I suppose. And so we've just done some very, very simple economic analysis here. So if we look at our nitrogen rate across the bottom of these 4 graphs, the first one we're looking at is just how much does the product cost? So obviously we're looking at a couple of scenarios here, a 30% premium cost, a 15% premium cost, and the conventional urea. And obviously, you know, the more you put on of the product, the more that cost differential increases. So using those sort of response graphs I showed before, we then can look at, well, how much is that worth to the farmer then? How much is that harvest return worth? And we're making some simple assumptions around, you know, 25 cents per kilogram of dry matter here. And, you know, obviously we see that additional feed we're producing does actually, you know, make a fair difference to the price return. We're looking at about 20 or 30 kilos. Once again, highest at that optimal rate. Okay, so obviously then the profit is the difference between those two. And this is, I suppose, the key thing is, you know, because the premium price of the inhibitor is more expensive, then that marginal return and that marginal N rate response. So as you put more and more of it on, you get less of a response. You really need to know that optimal to maximize your profitability. And so I suppose this is the risk you run with using this product. It gives you a little bit less flexibility, I suppose, because if you put on too much, then you're actually losing money. Well, you don't lose money, but you're losing your profitability. And you can see once again, we're looking at even at both premiums, our optimal rate is around that 30 kilos per application. Now this is a casino on an irrigated pasture, so it might change per region, but basically you're looking at, it's a rough rule of thumb, if you just reduce your standard urea application rate by about 20%, you should be right on that optimal, because that, you know, that standard application rate has been developed for your region over time, and what we're looking at is about a 20% saving of our nitrogen that's not being lost then. And if you don't sort of going above that, or if you're putting it on the same rate, because then other factors become limiting, it might become water limiting, it might become sulfur limiting, and we're not seeing that basically return on investment in that extra growth, then our profitability really sort of falls off the table. And that's what this last graph is looking at, is the marginal profit for every additional kilogram of nitrogen we put on. And you can see that we really hit this sweet spot around there. And if we go over that, then the additional money we're making from that additional urea starts to decline quite rapidly. So just in summary, so there's been a lot of work done on this in recent years, but I suppose they've been rather variable findings. And that's largely due to the differences in conditions that we can expect to see these things. So in this part of the world, urease, particularly, you know, being applied in that sort of winter spring period, urease has limited potential. And if we can get the product down onto the soil surface, down into the canopy, you know, our chance of volatilization losses are minimised. The nitrification inhibitors can actually increase yields. That effect is greater the more organic matter you have in the soil, because of this interaction with the organic matter. So if you remember back, we're looking at one of those those soils where the organic matter doesn't supply quite as much nitrogen, we're going to have less of an effect. We might still have an effect, but it's going to be less. So they're probably more effective in the heavier clay soils. So yeah, we often see a limited potential to see direct yield benefits. So you might put it on once to do a bit of a trial and you might not see anything. And remember, that's largely because it's the soil organic nitrogen is driving most of this productivity. And so you really need to apply it multiple times to start to see that benefit. And the most important thing is it needs to be applied at a reduced rate. So our nitrogen rates are traditionally been worked out over many years, already account for those losses. What the inhibitor does is it actually removes those losses or reduces those losses. And so if we put on the same amount, then something else becomes limiting. We need to basically reduce the amount we put on. And that's also critical for profitability then.
Thank you once again to Hunter Local Land Services for supporting this webinar today, and also to the Queensland University of Technology and for the University of Melbourne in providing both our speakers today. Again, the research for these webinars has been undertaken through the More Profit from Nitrogen program, supported by the Australian Government Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment through the Rural R&D for Profit program. So we thank them today.